Welcome to Midnight and Murder. When the world sleeps and night grow long, we delve together into the darkest corners of human nature. Good night. Case 1, the Dalsjö disappearance. On July 29, 1965, four young men from Gothenburg, Jan Olof Dalsjö, Kjell Ake Johansson, Leif Gustafsson, and Gunnar Appelgren, set off for a summer night drive in a green Volvo PV 444. The car, recently purchased second-hand, was borrowed by Jan from his parents. They left around 11 p.m., heading south, reportedly planning to visit friends near the small town of Kållered. None of them were ever seen again. What followed was one of Sweden's most baffling and enduring mysteries. Four men in a car vanished without a trace. The next morning, the Dalsjö family realized Jan hadn't returned home. At first, they assumed he'd stayed overnight with friends. But by late afternoon, when none of the boys could be reached, and all their homes confirmed they hadn't returned, concern escalated. The families contacted police. Initial searches began along the expected routes south of Gothenburg. Roads, lakes, parking areas, and rest stops were examined. When police realized the group hadn't reached their destination in Kållered, their route became speculative. Some believed that they had diverted to the coast. Others thought they might have gone camping inland. Their last known sighting was near Mölndal, just outside Gothenburg, around midnight. Despite extensive searches by ground and air, no trace of the vehicle or the boys was ever found. No tire tracks, no debris, no witnesses, nothing. Police dredged local lakes, divers searched the river Gota, fields were scanned for crash sites. Every lead led nowhere. The Volvo was a heavy, steel-frame model, not easily hidden or destroyed. Yet it seemed to have vanished into the earth. Urban legends spread quickly. Some claimed the boys had driven into a lake that had since silted over. Others suggested criminal involvement. Perhaps they had witnessed something and been silenced. A few theorized they had fled Sweden entirely. The families were devastated. Jan Dalsjö's mother refused to move from their home for decades, keeping the front room as he had left it. Every year on the anniversary, she placed candles in the window, hoping for news. In 1974, she gave a rare interview saying, "It's like they were taken by the fog, nothing left. Not even sorrow can rest without knowing." Over the decades, theories accumulated. In 1978, a man in Oslo claimed to have seen the group board a ferry to Denmark, but the passenger logs offered no support. In 1984, during a construction dig in Kungsbacka, a buried vehicle was uncovered, raising hopes. But it turned out to be a stolen car from the 1970s, unrelated. In 1993, a new theory emerged, that the group had taken a rarely used bridge over Lake Mjörn and accidentally driven off into deep water. Divers explored the lake again with sonar, but the muddy bottom and thick silt made it impossible to locate anything definitive. Nothing was found. The case faded from newspapers, but never from memory. In 2005, the missing Volvo PV 444 was listed by police as actively sought, and their profiles were updated with digital reconstructions. A reward fund was quietly reopened by surviving relatives. In 2012, a private dive team using advanced sonar scanned Lake Visken near Borås. They located several vehicles, including one similar in size and shape to the missing Volvo. But legal complications delayed recovery, and when it was finally examined 2 years later, it was determined to be a junk delivery van from the 1950s. Today, the Dalsjö disappearance remains unsolved. No bodies, no personal belongings, no confirmed sightings. Just four young men who drove into a Swedish summer night and never came back. What makes the case so haunting is the utter absence of clues. Not a shoe, not a license plate, not a scrap of metal. In an age before GPS, cell phones, or surveillance, their disappearance became a symbol of how quickly people could vanish, and how silence can stretch, year after year, until it becomes something permanent. Case 2, Jan Ingvar Lovgren, the girl killer. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, a shadow crept through the streets of Stockholm, a predator whose crimes would horrify the nation and scar its collective memory. His name was Jan Ingvar Lovgren, and he would become one of Sweden's most reviled serial killers. The press dubbed him Flick Morderen, the girl killer. Lovgren was born in 1930 in Stockholm. His early life was marked by poverty, instability, and neglect. His criminal behavior began with petty thefts, then escalated to violent assaults. By the age of 25, he had already served prison time for sexual offenses. He was described by psychiatrists as manipulative, with deep-seated misogyny and little impulse control. Yet outside prison, he was soft-spoken and socially unremarkable, a man who could vanish into a crowd. Between 1958 and 1963, a series of disappearances and brutal murders targeted young girls in and around the Stockholm area. The first was 10-year-old Barbro Svensson, reported missing after walking home from school. Her body was later discovered in a wooded area, strangled and partially buried. At the time, police had no suspect. Her death was ruled an isolated tragedy. The pattern didn't become clear until the second case. 12-year-old Anita Persson, abducted on her way to the corner store. Witnesses reported seeing her speaking to a man in a beige car. Days later, her body was found in a drainage canal. She had been sexually assaulted and beaten to death. Over the next 4 years, at least 6 more girls went missing. Most were found, eventually, dumped in ditches, shallow graves, or under bridges. All had similar wounds: strangulation, signs of prolonged restraint, and sexual violence. The fear in Stockholm grew rapidly. Parents no longer allowed their children to walk alone. Police began issuing public warnings. Investigators formed a special task force called Operation Flicka. What puzzled authorities was the randomness of the victims. They came from different neighborhoods with no clear link. But eventually, a pattern emerged. Each had been last seen near a bus stop, and each murder took place shortly after prison furlough periods in the region. Lovgren had served several short sentences during this time. He had been in and out of psychiatric care, diagnosed as having emotional instability and sexual deviance, but no one had linked him to the murders. He maintained a low profile, worked as a delivery driver, and kept to himself in a small apartment in southern Stockholm. His undoing came in June 1963, when 9-year-old Lena Nilsson was abducted in broad daylight. A quick-thinking witness, a teenage boy, had memorized the partial license plate of the car she was forced into. Police traced it back to a car registered to Lovgren's employer. When they arrived at his home, they found the girl's school bag in the trunk of his vehicle. Under interrogation, Lovgren confessed to Lena's murder and 5 others. His statements were chillingly calm. He described his methods in detail, often correcting the investigators when they misstated facts. He said he couldn't help himself, and that the girls shouldn't have talked to strangers. He showed no remorse. The trial began in late 1963. The courtroom was packed with journalists and grieving families. Lovgren sat quietly, showing no emotion. A panel of psychiatrists testified that he had antisocial personality disorder and was highly likely to reoffend. The prosecution argued that he was a cold, calculating predator who knew exactly what he was doing. He was found guilty of 6 murders and sentenced to closed psychiatric care, Sweden's version of indefinite confinement for the criminally insane. He was committed to Säters sjukhus, a high-security psychiatric hospital, where he remained for the rest of his life. Reports from staff described him as cooperative but emotionally vacant. He rarely spoke, never admitted guilt beyond the trial, and refused interviews. Lovgren died in 2002, alone and largely forgotten. He was buried in an unmarked grave, his crimes still haunting the families of the girls he murdered. His case led to major changes in how Sweden handled psychiatric evaluations, prison furloughs, and child abduction protocols. Furlough for sex offenders was severely restricted. Police procedures for missing children were revised to launch immediate investigations. Even today, older residents of Stockholm remember the years when parents clutched their children tighter, when playgrounds emptied early, and when the name Flick Morderin was whispered with dread. Case 3, the Butcher of Rostov. In the vast expanse of the Soviet Union during the 1970s and 1980s, a darkness spread across the industrial cities and rural villages that would challenge everything the communist state believed about itself. This is the story of Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo, a man whose crimes would earn him the terrifying nickname, the Butcher of Rostov, and force an entire nation to confront the reality that monsters could exist even in their socialist paradise. The story begins not with violence, but with hunger. Born on October 16, 1936, in the small village of Yabloknoye in Ukraine, Andrei Chikatilo entered a world already marked by suffering. His childhood unfolded during one of the darkest periods in Soviet history, the Holodomor, Stalin's man-made famine that would claim millions of Ukrainian lives. The specter of starvation haunted young Andrei's earliest memories, shaping him in ways that would resonate decades later in the most horrific manner imaginable. Chikatilo's mother, Anna, would tell him stories that seemed almost too terrible to believe. She spoke of his older brother, Stepan, who had disappeared during the famine years. According to family legend, Stepan had been kidnapped and cannibalized by desperate, starving neighbors. Whether this story was true or merely another tragic myth born from those desperate times, it planted seeds of violence and sexual confusion in young Andrei's developing mind. The themes of hunger, consumption, and the violation of human flesh would echo through his consciousness for the rest of his life. The boy grew up physically weak and emotionally fragile. He was severely myopic, requiring thick glasses that made him a target for bullying. His appearance, gangly, awkward, with protruding ears and those distinctive thick spectacles, marked him as different from his peers. More troubling still were the problems he began experiencing during adolescence. Chikatilo discovered he suffered from chronic impotence, a condition that would torment him throughout his adult life and contribute to the sexual violence that would later define his crimes. As a student, Chikatilo was intelligent but unremarkable. He harbored dreams of studying at Moscow University, but his family's peasant background and his own social awkwardness made such aspirations nearly impossible in the rigidly stratified Soviet system. Instead, he found himself pursuing teaching, a profession that would give him access to the vulnerable young people who would later become his preferred victims. In 1963, at the age of 27, Chikatilo married Feodosia Odnacheva, a woman his sister had introduced to him. Their marriage was arranged more out of social expectation than genuine affection, and it was troubled from the beginning by Chikatilo's sexual dysfunction. Unable to perform normally, he could only achieve arousal through violence and domination. This pattern would manifest first in his marriage, where he would often assault his wife and later extend to his interactions with students and, ultimately, his victims. The couple eventually had 2 children, Lyudmila and Yuri, though the circumstances of their conception remain unclear. Some accounts suggest that Chikatilo's wife became pregnant through artificial means, while others indicate that his ability to function sexually was sporadic and often required extreme mental stimulation involving violent fantasies. As a teacher, Chikatilo began to exhibit the predatory behavior that would escalate over time. He would often touch his students inappropriately, corner young girls in empty classrooms, and make sexual advances that led to several complaints. His inability to control these urges resulted in his dismissal from multiple teaching positions, forcing him to move from town to town across the Soviet Union, always staying one step ahead of his reputation. The family eventually settled in Rostov-on-Don, a major industrial city in southern Russia, where Chikatilo found work as a supply clerk for a factory. This position required him to travel frequently throughout the region, purchasing materials and coordinating deliveries. These business trips would provide him with the perfect cover for his developing murderous activities, as he could disappear for days at a time without arousing suspicion from his family or employers. The transformation from sexual deviant to killer was gradual but inexorable. Chikatilo's fantasies became increasingly violent, and his failed attempts at normal sexual encounters left him frustrated and angry. He began to associate sexual arousal with violence, and violence with the ultimate expression of power over another human being. The stage was set for horror. On December 22, 1978, Andrei Chikatilo committed his first murder. The victim was 9-year-old Yelena Zakonova, a young girl he had lured into an abandoned house in the town of Shakhty. What happened in that decrepit building would establish the pattern for dozens of future killings. Chikatilo attempted to rape the child, but his impotence made the assault impossible. In his rage and frustration, he stabbed her repeatedly with a knife, discovering to his shock and terrible excitement that the act of killing provided him with the sexual release that had eluded him throughout his adult life. The murder of Yelena Zakonova was both more brutal and more psychologically significant than anyone at the time could have understood. As the child lay dying, Chikatilo experienced what he would later describe as the most intense pleasure of his life. The connection between violence, death, and sexual satisfaction had been forged in his twisted psyche, creating a pattern that would drive him to kill again and again. Local police investigated the murder, but had little experience with such crimes. The Soviet Union officially maintained that serial killers were a product of capitalist decadence and could not exist in their socialist society. This ideological blindness would prove to be one of Chikatilo's greatest advantages in the years to come. Instead of looking for a serial predator, investigators focused on traditional motives: robbery, personal disputes, or crimes of passion. A local man named Alexander Kravchenko was eventually arrested for Yelena's murder. Under the brutal interrogation methods common in Soviet criminal justice, Kravchenko confessed to the crime. He was executed in 1984, taking the blame for Chikatilo's first murder and leaving the real killer free to continue his rampage. For nearly 3 years after Yelena's death, Chikatilo managed to control his murderous urges. He threw himself into his work, traveled extensively for his job, and maintained the facade of a normal family life. But the memory of that December night in 1978 haunted him, and the sexual satisfaction he had experienced through killing proved impossible to replicate through any other means. In September 1981, Chikatilo struck again. This time the victim was 17-year-old Larisa Tkachenko, a young woman he encountered at a bus station in Rostov. He convinced her to walk with him into a nearby forest where he attempted to rape her. When his impotence again prevented the assault, he flew into a murderous rage, stabbing and mutilating her body with a ferocity that shocked even him. The killing of Larisa Tkachenko marked the beginning of Chikatilo's most active period as a serial killer. Having discovered that murder could provide him with sexual satisfaction, he began to develop a more systematic approach to finding and killing victims. He would target the most vulnerable members of Soviet society: runaways, prostitutes, vagrants, and children, people whose disappearances might not be immediately noticed or thoroughly investigated. Chikatilo's method of operation became increasingly refined. He would approach potential victims at train stations, bus stops, or on the streets, presenting himself as a helpful authority figure or friendly stranger. His appearance, middle-aged, well-dressed, wearing glasses, made him seem harmless and trustworthy. He would offer food, money, or shelter to desperate individuals, leading them to secluded areas where he could attack without fear of interruption. The murders themselves followed a horrific pattern. Chikatilo would attempt rape, fail due to his impotence, then explode into homicidal fury. He would stab his victims repeatedly, often dozens of times, focusing his attacks on the sexual organs, eyes, and mouth. In many cases, he would partially consume the bodies, biting off pieces of flesh in a cannibalistic frenzy that echoed the stories his mother had told him about his brother's fate during the famine years. The geographical scope of Chikatilo's crimes was vast. His job required him to travel throughout southern Russia and Ukraine, and he left a trail of bodies across hundreds of miles. Victims were found in forests, abandoned buildings, railway yards, and remote fields. The sheer distance between crime scenes made it difficult for investigators to recognize patterns or coordinate their efforts. As the body count rose throughout the early 1980s, Soviet authorities found themselves facing an unprecedented crisis. The official ideology insisted that such crimes were impossible in their society, yet the evidence was undeniable. Multiple police jurisdictions were involved, each investigating their cases independently without sharing information effectively. The lack of modern forensic techniques, combined with bureaucratic incompetence and ideological blindness, allowed Chikatilo to continue killing with virtual impunity. The investigation that would eventually lead to Chikatilo's capture began in earnest in 1982, when Major Mikhail Fedosov was assigned to coordinate the various murder investigations. Fedosov was one of the few Soviet officials willing to acknowledge that they might be dealing with a serial killer, despite the political implications of such an admission. Working with psychiatrist Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky, Fedosov began to develop a psychological profile of the killer. Bukhanovsky's analysis proved remarkably accurate, describing the perpetrator as a middle-aged man with sexual dysfunction, probably employed in a position that required travel, and driven by a combination of sexual frustration and sadistic impulses. The investigation was hampered by numerous false leads and wrongful arrests. The pressure to solve the case led police to torture confessions from innocent suspects, and several men were executed for crimes they did not commit. Meanwhile, Chikatilo continued his killing spree, growing bolder and more vicious with each attack. By 1984, the investigation had identified several key patterns. Most victims were found near railway stations or bus stops, suggesting the killer used public transportation. The timing of the murders often corresponded with school holidays or weekends, when children and young people might be traveling alone. The geographic distribution of the crimes indicated someone who traveled regularly for work. Despite these insights, Chikatilo remained elusive. He was actually questioned by police on several occasions, but was released each time. His appearance as a respectable middle-aged professional, combined with his ability to maintain his composure under questioning, allowed him to avoid suspicion. Additionally, his blood type appeared to differ from samples found at crime scenes due to a rare condition that caused his blood and other bodily fluids to contain different antigens, a genetic quirk that would protect him for years. As the 1980s progressed, Chikatilo's crimes became increasingly savage. No longer content with simple stabbing, he began to mutilate his victims more extensively, often removing and consuming sexual organs, cutting out eyes and inflicting wounds that seemed to serve no purpose other than to cause maximum suffering. The crime scenes became so horrific that even experienced investigators were traumatized by what they witnessed. The killer's appetite seemed insatiable. In some years, he would murder more than a dozen victims, striking with a frequency that suggested he was completely consumed by his compulsions. He began to take greater risks, attacking victims in daylight or in areas where discovery was more likely. This increasing boldness would eventually contribute to his downfall. The breakthrough in the case came in 1985, when Chikatilo was arrested near a crime scene but was released due to lack of evidence. However, his name was now in the investigation files, and he was placed under periodic surveillance. This surveillance was sporadic and often ineffective, but it represented the first time investigators had focused specifically on him as a suspect. Throughout the late 1980s, as the Soviet Union began to undergo the dramatic changes associated with glasnost and perestroika, the investigation into the serial murders became more sophisticated. New forensic techniques were introduced, communication between different police jurisdictions improved, and the ideological restrictions that had previously hampered the investigation began to loosen. Dr. Bukhanovsky continued to refine his psychological profile, and his insights proved increasingly valuable. He predicted that the killer would be unable to stop murdering voluntarily and that he would eventually make a mistake that would lead to his capture. This prediction proved prophetic. In 1988, Chikatilo's killing spree reached new heights of brutality. He murdered at least 8 people that year, including several children whose deaths were so savage that they shocked even hardened investigators. The pressure on law enforcement to solve the case became enormous, with high-ranking Soviet officials demanding results. The investigation received additional resources and personnel, and a special task force was created to coordinate efforts across multiple jurisdictions. Advanced forensic techniques were employed, including early DNA analysis and sophisticated crime scene reconstruction. For the first time since the killings began, law enforcement seemed to be gaining ground on their quarry. The end came suddenly in November 1990. Chikatilo had traveled to the town of Donlaskos for his work and had murdered a young woman named Svetlana Korostik. As he was leaving the area, he was observed by police officers who were conducting routine patrols near the railway station. His nervous behavior and the fact that he was washing his hands and face at a public fountain aroused their suspicion. When officers approached Chikatilo, they noticed that his clothing appeared disheveled and that he had what looked like bloodstains on his coat. A search of his belongings revealed a knife and other suspicious items. Although he initially tried to explain away these discoveries, the coincidence of his presence near a fresh crime scene, combined with his previous appearances in the investigation files, was too significant to ignore. Chikatilo was arrested and taken into custody for questioning. Initially, he maintained his innocence, presenting himself as a respectable family man who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. However, the investigators now had sophisticated interrogation techniques at their disposal, and they had spent years studying the psychology of their suspect. The breakthrough came when Dr. Bukhanovsky was brought in to interview Chikatilo. The psychiatrist's deep understanding of the killer's psychology allowed him to establish a rapport that previous interrogators had failed to achieve. Bukhanovsky spoke to Chikatilo not as a criminal, but as a patient, acknowledging his sexual dysfunction and the psychological trauma he had experienced throughout his life. Under this sympathetic approach, Chikatilo's defenses began to crumble. He started to admit to some of the murders, initially claiming responsibility for only a few deaths. However, as the interrogation continued over several days, his confessions became more detailed and comprehensive. He seemed almost relieved to finally be able to discuss the crimes that had dominated his thoughts for more than a decade. The full scope of Chikatilo's crimes was staggering. He confessed to 56 murders, providing detailed descriptions of each killing that matched the evidence found at crime scenes. His victims ranged in age from 9 to 45, though most were children or young adults. The murders had occurred across a vast geographic area, spanning multiple Soviet republics and covering more than a dozen years. What emerged from Chikatilo's confessions was a portrait of a man completely consumed by his compulsions. He described the intense sexual arousal he experienced during the murders, the satisfaction of exerting complete control over another human being, and the cannibalistic acts that had become an integral part of his ritual. His accounts were so detailed and disturbing that even experienced investigators found them difficult to hear. The trial of Andrei Chikatilo began in April 1992 in the newly independent Russian Federation. The proceedings were conducted in a specially constructed cage designed to protect the defendant from the families of his victims, many of whom attended the sessions in hopes of understanding why their loved ones had died. Chikatilo's behavior during the trial was erratic and disturbing. He would sometimes sit quietly, appearing almost catatonic, while at other times he would launch into rambling speeches about his crimes or his philosophical views on life and death. He showed no remorse for his actions and seemed to view the proceedings as an opportunity to relive his murders in public. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of Chikatilo's guilt, including his detailed confessions, physical evidence linking him to crime scenes, and testimony from forensic experts. The defense attempted to argue that their client was mentally ill and not responsible for his actions. But this strategy proved ineffective given the calculated nature of many of his crimes. On October 15, 1992, Andrei Chikatilo was found guilty of 52 murders and sentenced to death. The verdict was met with approval from the families of victims and the general public, who had followed the case with horrified fascination. The trial had been one of the first major criminal proceedings in post-Soviet Russia to receive extensive media coverage, and Chikatilo had become a symbol of the violence and chaos that many associated with the collapse of the old system. Chikatilo spent his final years on death row in a prison in Rostov-on-Don, the city where many of his crimes had been committed. He continued to maintain his innocence regarding some of the murders while providing additional details about others. Prison officials reported that he seemed to derive continued satisfaction from discussing his crimes and appeared to show no genuine remorse for his actions. On February 14, 1994, Valentine's Day, Andrei Chikatilo was executed by a single gunshot to the head in accordance with Soviet-era execution protocols that were still in effect. He was 57 years old and had spent the last 4 years of his life in custody. With his death, one of the most notorious serial killing sprees in modern history finally came to an end. The case of Andrei Chikatilo had profound effects on Soviet and Russian society that extended far beyond the immediate horror of his crimes. For the first time, the Soviet public was forced to confront the reality that their system could produce monsters just as terrifying as any found in capitalist countries. The official ideology that had insisted such crimes were impossible in a socialist society was thoroughly discredited. The investigation also highlighted serious problems with Soviet law enforcement and forensic science. The lack of coordination between different police jurisdictions, the absence of modern investigative techniques, and the ideological constraints that had hampered the investigation became subjects of intense scrutiny and reform. Perhaps most significantly, the Chikatilo case marked a turning point in how the Soviet Union and later Russia dealt with violent crime. The publicity surrounding the trial helped to establish a more open and realistic approach to criminal justice, paving the way for improved investigative techniques and international cooperation in law enforcement. The psychological study of Chikatilo also contributed to the development of criminal profiling in the former Soviet Union. Dr. Bukhanovsky's work on the case became a foundational text for understanding serial killers in the Russian context, and his techniques were adopted by law enforcement agencies throughout the region. For the families of Chikatilo's victims, The conclusion of the case brought a measure of closure, but could never fully heal the wounds left by their losses. Many had waited more than a decade for answers about their loved ones' deaths. And while the trial provided those answers, it also forced them to confront the horrific details of how their family members had died. The story of Andrei Chikatilo serves as a chilling reminder of the capacity for evil that can exist within seemingly ordinary individuals. His crimes were not the result of a sudden breakdown or a momentary loss of control, but rather the product of a lifetime of sexual dysfunction, psychological trauma, and gradually escalating violence. The case also demonstrates the importance of effective law enforcement cooperation and the dangers of allowing ideological considerations to interfere with criminal investigations. Had Soviet authorities been willing to acknowledge the possibility of serial killing from the beginning, many lives might have been saved. Today, more than 3 decades after his capture, Andrei Chikatilo remains one of the most studied and notorious serial killers in history. His case continues to be examined by criminologists, psychologists, and law enforcement professionals, seeking to understand the factors that can transform a human being into a predator capable of such extreme violence. The forests and urban areas of southern Russia where Chikatilo committed his crimes have returned to normal life, but the memory of his reign of terror lingers. Memorials to his victims serve as reminders of the innocent lives lost to his compulsions, while the lessons learned from the investigation continue to inform modern approaches to catching serial killers. In the end, the story of the Butcher of Rostov is not just about one man's descent into murderous madness, but about a society's struggle to confront the reality of evil in its midst. It is a tale that speaks to the darkest aspects of human nature, while also highlighting the persistence and dedication of those who work to bring justice to the victims of such crimes. The case of Andrei Chikatilo closed a dark chapter in Russian criminal history, but it also opened new possibilities for understanding and preventing such crimes in the future. His legacy is one of horror and tragedy, but also of hard-won knowledge about the nature of serial violence and the importance of never giving up the search for justice, no matter how long it may take. As we reflect on this case decades later, we are reminded that monsters can indeed walk among us, hidden behind facades of normalcy and respectability. The story of Andrei Chikatilo serves as both a warning about the potential for evil that exists in our world and a testament to the power of persistence and scientific investigation to eventually bring even the most elusive criminals to justice. The victims of the Butcher of Rostov, children, teenagers, and young adults whose lives were cut tragically short, deserve to be remembered not just as statistics in a criminal case, but as individuals whose potential was stolen by one man's inability to control his darkest impulses. Their memory serves as a reminder of the preciousness of life and the importance of protecting the vulnerable members of our society from those who would do them harm. In the quiet moments before sleep, when the world grows still and darkness settles over the landscape, we might pause to remember those who fell victim to Andrei Chikatilo's terrible compulsions. Their stories, tragic as they are, remind us of the importance of vigilance, compassion, and the never-ending struggle between good and evil that defines the human experience. The Butcher of Rostov is gone, but the lessons of his case remain. In understanding how such monsters are made and how they can be stopped, we honor the memory of those who died and work to ensure that such tragedies are never repeated. This is perhaps the most fitting tribute we can offer to the victims of one of history's most notorious serial killers, that their deaths were not in vain, but served to make the world a safer place for those who came after them. Case 4. The Disappearance of Alvar Larsson. On the morning of April 16, 1967, 13-year-old Alvar Larsson walked out of his family's farmhouse on the island of Surko in the Lake Asnen, southern Sweden. He told his parents he was going for a walk before breakfast. He was wearing a dark jacket, blue jeans, and black rubber boots. It was around 8 a.m. He never returned. Surko, located in Kronoberg County, is a quiet, sparsely populated island, connected to the mainland by a narrow road and surrounded by dense forest and farmland. Alvar was the middle child of 3, known to be quiet, well-behaved, and reliable. His father, Gunnar Larsson, was a farmer. His mother, Karen, stayed home with the children. That morning, no one thought anything unusual about Alvar taking a short walk. He often went out to check on the family's livestock or walk in the woods behind their home. But by mid-morning, when he hadn't come back, His mother grew concerned. By noon, the family was walking the property, calling for him. By 2 p.m., neighbors had joined the search. That evening, the police were contacted. Within 24 hours, the Swedish military was involved. Local police, volunteers, and soldiers scoured the island on foot and by air. Dogs were brought in, boats searched the shoreline, and divers explored the lake near the farm. The entire island was mapped and divided into zones. Barns, wells, and cellars were searched. Forests were combed line by line. No trace of Alvar was found. The search continued for weeks. There were no signs of struggle, no clues of foul play, no tracks. The ground was soft that time of year, still wet from spring thaw, but no boot prints matched his. There were no reports of strangers on the island, no vehicles seen, no boats missing. By May, police considered all possibilities: accident, abduction, voluntary disappearance. But Alvar had no known enemies, no behavioral problems, and no reason to run away. He had a math test the next day, which he had studied for. His family insisted he was in good spirits. Months passed, posters were printed, radio stations mentioned his name. Psychics wrote letters claiming visions of the boy's fate. Every tip was investigated, nothing led anywhere. The official theory became that he had fallen into the lake and drowned, though no body surfaced. Skeptics argued that even a drowned body in Asnan, shallow in most areas, would have eventually been found. The case went cold. 15 years later, in the summer of 1982, a man walking on a remote island about 4 kilometers from the Larson farm made a discovery. Lying near the shore, half covered by moss and leaves, was a human skull. Forensic examination confirmed it belonged to Alvar Larsson. There were no other bones, only the skull. It was remarkably well preserved, with no visible damage. There were no signs of trauma, fracture, or gunshot. But its location raised immediate questions. The island was isolated. Alvar had no known way to reach it, and there were no bridges or boats missing in 1967. Theories spread quickly. Was he abducted by boat? Killed and transported there? Did he try to swim? Police considered the possibility that someone had taken him, kept him alive for some time, and later dumped his body on the island. But there were no known suspects, no arrests, and no further remains found, despite renewed searches. The skull's location made accidental drowning unlikely. The direction of lake currents didn't match the place it was found. Moreover, Alvar had no reason to go there. It wasn't a place he visited. He had no friends there. It was wilderness. Swedish newspapers reopened the case with dramatic headlines: "The boy who came back as a skull," "Island Secrets," "The Vanishing of Alvar." But the renewed attention brought no new leads. His parents, still alive in 1982, were given the skull and buried it in the local churchyard. They declined most interviews. In one statement, his mother said, "We raised him, we fed him, we put him to bed each night. He didn't just vanish." Theories persist to this day. Some believe Alvar was kidnapped by someone with a boat and murdered far from home. Others believe he died accidentally and animals scattered the remains. A few believe he lived for some time after his disappearance. One local rumor speculates that a former neighbor, now dead, may have had something to do with it, but no evidence has ever supported that. To this day, Alvar Larsson's disappearance remains one of Sweden's most haunting unsolved cases. A child vanished without trace in a place where everyone knew everyone, and where danger was thought to be a distant thing. All that remains is a skull, an old farmhouse, and the silence of a mystery that may never be solved. Case 5, Metal Fang, the Nikolai Zhumagaliev story. In the vast steppes of Kazakhstan, where the endless grasslands stretch toward distant horizons and the wind carries whispers of ancient nomadic peoples, a darkness emerged in the late 20th century that would challenge everything we thought we knew about human nature. This is the story of Nikolai Zhumagaliev, a man whose crimes were so horrific and bizarre that they seemed to belong more to the realm of nightmares than reality. Known by the chilling nickname Metal Fang, his tale is one of the most disturbing chapters in the annals of Soviet-era crime. The story begins in 1952 in the city of Uzgen, in what was then the Kyrgyz Soviet Socialist Republic, now modern-day Kyrgyzstan. Nikolai Zhumagaliev was born into a world still recovering from the devastation of World War II, where the Soviet Union was rebuilding itself under Stalin's iron grip. His early years were marked by the typical hardships of Soviet life: food shortages, cramped living conditions, and the ever-present atmosphere of state surveillance and control. From the beginning, Nikolai was different from other children. His parents, simple working-class people trying to make their way in the socialist system, noticed that their son displayed unusual behavioral patterns from an early age. He was withdrawn and sullen, preferring to spend time alone rather than playing with other children. When he did interact with his peers, these encounters often ended badly, with Nikolai displaying sudden bursts of violence that seemed to come from nowhere. As he grew older, these troubling signs became more pronounced. Nikolai showed an unusual fascination with violence and death, often torturing small animals and displaying no empathy for their suffering. His parents, like many Soviet citizens of their generation, attributed these behaviors to the general hardships of their times rather than recognizing them as warning signs of something far more sinister developing in their son's psyche. The nickname Metal Fang, that would later strike fear into the hearts of those who heard it, originated from a dental procedure Nikolai underwent as a young man. After losing several teeth in what was reported as an accident, he had them replaced with metal dental work that gave his smile a distinctly unsettling appearance. The glint of metal when he opened his mouth, combined with his already intimidating physical presence, created an image that people found deeply disturbing. Nikolai was a large man, standing well over 6 feet tall, with a powerful build that he maintained through manual labor and an increasingly obsessive fitness regimen. His dark hair and intense eyes, combined with those distinctive metal teeth, created an appearance that seemed to embody menace. Those who met him often reported feeling an immediate sense of unease, as if they were in the presence of something fundamentally wrong, though they couldn't always articulate why. As a young adult, Zhumagaliev drifted through various jobs across the Soviet Union, never staying in one place for very long. He worked as a laborer, a security guard, and briefly served in the Soviet military, though his service record was marked by disciplinary problems and concerns about his psychological stability. His supervisors consistently noted his difficulty working with others and his tendency towards sudden, inexplicable outbursts of rage. It was during this period of wandering that Nikolai began to develop the obsessions that would eventually drive him to murder. He became fascinated with the idea of consumption, not just of food, but of human flesh. This cannibalistic fixation seemed to grow from a combination of psychological factors: his early exposure to stories of wartime starvation, his own troubled relationship with nurturing and care, and what appears to have been an underlying psychopathology that manifested in increasingly disturbing ways. The transformation from disturbed individual to active predator occurred gradually throughout the 1970s. Nikolai began stalking potential victims, learning their routines, and identifying those who would be least likely to be missed. He showed a particular preference for targeting women, especially those who were alone and vulnerable. His approach was methodical and patient, characteristics that would later make him extremely difficult for law enforcement to catch. His first confirmed murder occurred in 1980, though investigators later suspected he may have been killing for several years before this incident came to their attention. The victim was a young woman he had encountered while traveling through a rural area of Kazakhstan. What happened next would establish the horrific pattern that would characterize all of Nikolai's subsequent crimes. After killing his victim through strangulation, Zhumagaliev began the ritualistic mutilation and consumption of the body. This was not a crime of passion or sudden violence, but rather a carefully planned and executed act that fulfilled deep psychological needs within the killer's twisted psyche. He would later describe the experience as transcendent, claiming that consuming human flesh gave him a sense of power and satisfaction that nothing else in his life had ever provided. The most disturbing aspect of Zhumagaliev's crimes was not just the cannibalism itself, but what he did with the remains of his victims. Rather than simply disposing of the evidence, he would carefully prepare portions of the flesh, treating it like any other meat. He would then invite friends, acquaintances, and even strangers to dinner parties at his apartment, serving them meals that contained human flesh without their knowledge. These dinner parties became a regular occurrence throughout the early 1980s. Nikolai was known in his neighborhood as a generous host who would frequently invite people over for elaborate meals. His guests praised his cooking skills and often asked for recipes, never suspecting that they were participating in acts of unknowing cannibalism. The psychological satisfaction Jumagaliev derived from these gatherings seemed to be almost as important to him as the actual murders themselves. The scope of these dinner parties was staggering. Investigators later estimated that dozens, possibly hundreds of people, unknowingly consumed human flesh at Nikolai's table. The thought of how many innocent people were made unwitting participants in his crimes adds an additional layer of horror to an already unthinkable situation. Meanwhile, the murders continued. Jumagaliev developed an increasingly sophisticated method of selecting and approaching his victims. He would often present himself as a helpful stranger, offering assistance to women who appeared to be in distress or need. His large size and apparent strength made him seem like a protector rather than a threat, and many victims willingly accompanied him to secluded locations where he could attack without fear of interruption. The killing method remained consistent across all of his confirmed murders. Jumagaliev would strangle his victims, using his considerable physical strength to overpower them quickly and efficiently. This method served multiple purposes. It was relatively quiet. It didn't damage the body in ways that would interfere with his cannibalistic rituals, and it gave him a sense of intimate control over the dying process. After each murder, the ritual would begin. Jumagaliev had developed elaborate procedures for dismembering and preparing the bodies, treating the entire process like a sacred ceremony. He would often spend hours with each victim, not just consuming portions of the flesh, but also engaging in other forms of desecration that investigators found too disturbing to describe in detail to the public. The geographic scope of Jumagaliev's crimes was vast, spanning multiple Soviet republics and covering thousands of miles. His willingness to travel extensively made it extremely difficult for law enforcement agencies to recognize patterns or coordinate their investigations. Each murder was initially treated as an isolated incident, and the lack of effective communication between different police jurisdictions allowed him to continue killing with relative impunity. The Soviet system's approach to criminal investigation was also hampered by ideological constraints. Officials were reluctant to acknowledge that such extreme crimes could occur in their socialist society, and there was institutional resistance to the idea that they might be dealing with a serial killer of such unprecedented savagery. This denial and bureaucratic inefficiency provided Jumagaliev with additional protection from detection. As the body count rose throughout the early 1980s, a few dedicated investigators began to notice similarities between murders occurring across different regions. The victims were all women, all killed in the same manner, and all showed evidence of post-mortem mutilation and partial consumption. Slowly, the horrifying reality began to emerge that they were dealing with not just a serial killer, but a cannibal of extraordinary depravity. The investigation was further complicated by Jumagaliev's ability to maintain a facade of normalcy in his daily life. To his neighbors and casual acquaintances, he appeared to be just another Soviet citizen trying to make his way in a difficult system. He was polite, if somewhat withdrawn, and his reputation as a generous host who frequently entertained guests actually worked in his favor, making him seem like an upstanding member of the community. The breakthrough in the case came in 1982 through a combination of improved investigative techniques and a stroke of luck that finally put investigators on Jumagaliev's trail. A witness had seen him with one of the victims shortly before her disappearance, and when police went to question him, they noticed several suspicious details about his living situation. First, there was the matter of the smell. Despite Jumagaliev's attempts to maintain cleanliness, the odor of decomposing flesh permeated his apartment. When investigators obtained a search warrant, they discovered evidence that left even seasoned professionals stunned and nauseated. The apartment contained human remains in various stages of preparation, along with cooking equipment and recipes that had been adapted for use with human flesh. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the discovery of Jumagaliev's journals, in which he had meticulously documented his crimes. These writings revealed not just the details of the murders themselves, but also his psychological state during and after each killing. The journals showed a man who was not only aware of the horror of his actions, but who actively reveled in them, deriving not just physical satisfaction, but intellectual pleasure from his ability to deceive and manipulate those around him. The journals also revealed the full extent of the dinner parties and the number of people who had unknowingly participated in cannibalistic acts. This discovery sent shockwaves through the communities where Zhumagalev had lived, as hundreds of people suddenly realized they had been victims of his deception. The psychological trauma inflicted on these unwitting participants became a secondary aspect of his crimes that would have lasting effects for years to come. When confronted with the evidence, Zhumagalev initially denied everything, maintaining his innocence despite the overwhelming physical proof found in his apartment. However, as the interrogation continued, his facade began to crumble. Unlike many criminals who express remorse when caught, Nikolai seemed almost proud of what he had accomplished, viewing his crimes as achievements rather than atrocities. The confession, when it finally came, was both detailed and chilling. Zhumagalev described each murder methodically, showing no emotion as he recounted the suffering of his victims. He spoke about the cannibalistic aspects of his crimes with the same matter-of-fact tone that one might use to describe a cooking recipe, displaying a complete absence of normal human empathy or moral understanding. Most disturbing of all was his attitude toward the dinner parties. Zhumagalev expressed particular satisfaction in having successfully deceived so many people, viewing their unknowing participation in cannibalism as evidence of his superior intelligence and cunning. He seemed to derive as much pleasure from this aspect of his crimes as from the murders themselves. The trial of Nikolai Zhumagalev began in 1983 and became one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in Soviet history. The details that emerged during the trial were so shocking that court officials imposed strict limits on media coverage, fearing that full disclosure of the facts would cause public panic and undermine confidence in the Soviet system's ability to protect its citizens. Zhumagalev's behavior during the trial alternated between periods of apparent lucidity and episodes of bizarre behavior that suggested serious mental illness. He would sometimes sit quietly for hours, staring at the ceiling or walls, while at other times he would launch into rambling speeches about his philosophy of life and death. He showed no remorse for his actions and seemed to view the proceedings as an opportunity to gain attention and notoriety. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of Zhumagalev's guilt, including physical evidence from his apartment, witness testimony, and his own detailed confessions. The defense attempted to argue that their client was mentally incompetent and should be committed to a psychiatric facility rather than executed. But this strategy proved ineffective given the calculated and methodical nature of his crimes. The trial revealed additional disturbing details about Zhumagalev's psychology and methods. Expert witnesses testified about the extreme planning and preparation that had gone into each murder, contradicting any suggestion that the crimes were the result of sudden mental breakdown or uncontrollable impulses. Instead, the evidence painted a picture of a highly organized and methodical killer who had developed his techniques over many years. On October 13, 1983, Nikolai Zhumagalev was found guilty of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death. The verdict was met with relief from the families of his victims and from the broader Soviet public, who had followed the case with horrified fascination. However, the sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment, reflecting changing attitudes toward capital punishment in the Soviet system. What happened next would add yet another chapter to the already incredible story of Medelfang. In 1989, during the period of political upheaval associated with the collapse of the Soviet Union, Zhumagalev managed to escape from the psychiatric facility where he was being held. The circumstances of his escape remain unclear, but it appears to have been facilitated by the general chaos and confusion that characterized the final years of Soviet rule. The escape sent shockwaves throughout the region and beyond. Here was a man who had committed some of the most horrific crimes in Soviet history, now free and potentially able to resume his murderous activities. A massive manhunt was launched involving law enforcement agencies from multiple republics. But Zhumagalev had simply vanished. For months, there were reported sightings of the escaped cannibal throughout Central Asia and beyond. Some of these reports were undoubtedly false, the product of public hysteria and imagination. But others seemed credible enough to warrant serious investigation. The fear generated by his escape was amplified by the knowledge that he had successfully evaded detection for years before his original capture. The mystery deepened when, in 1991, Zhumagalev was reportedly spotted in Moscow, where he was said to have been living under an assumed identity. However, by the time authorities responded to these reports, he had disappeared again. This pattern would repeat itself several times over the following years, with confirmed sightings followed by successful escapes that suggested he had developed sophisticated methods for evading capture. The most reliable account of Jumagaliev's whereabouts came in 1992, when he was reportedly living in Uzbekistan and had resumed killing. Local authorities claimed to have evidence linking him to several murders that bore his distinctive signature. But before they could apprehend him, he had once again vanished without a trace. Since then, the trail has gone cold. Despite occasional unconfirmed reports and alleged sightings, Nikolai Zhumagaliev has effectively disappeared from official records. Whether he is still alive, still killing, or has died from natural causes remains unknown. The uncertainty surrounding his fate has only added to the legend of Medelfang, making him one of the most notorious fugitives in criminal history. The case of Nikolai Zhumagaliev had profound and lasting effects on Soviet and post-Soviet society. For the first time, the public was forced to confront the reality that their system could produce monsters of unprecedented depravity. The official ideology that had insisted such extreme crimes were impossible in a socialist society was thoroughly discredited by the evidence of his atrocities. The psychological impact on the communities where Zhumagaliev had operated was devastating. Hundreds of people who had attended his dinner parties were forced to confront the horrifying realization that they had unknowingly participated in acts of cannibalism. Many required extensive psychological counseling, and some never fully recovered from the trauma of this discovery. The case also highlighted serious deficiencies in Soviet law enforcement and forensic capabilities. The lack of coordination between different police jurisdictions, the absence of modern investigative techniques, and the ideological constraints that had initially hampered the investigation became subjects of intense scrutiny and reform efforts that would continue long after the Soviet Union's collapse. From a criminological perspective, the Zhumagaliev case remains one of the most studied examples of extreme criminal behavior. His combination of serial murder, cannibalism, and the systematic deception of innocent people represents a unique form of criminal pathology that has few parallels in the literature of criminal psychology. Researchers have attempted to understand the factors that could have produced such extreme behavior. Zhumagaliev's childhood, while difficult, was not notably more traumatic than that of millions of other Soviet citizens who grew up during the same period. His psychological profile suggests a rare combination of psychopathic traits, including complete lack of empathy, extraordinary manipulative ability, and a capacity for long-term planning that made him particularly dangerous. The cannibalistic aspect of his crimes has been the subject of particular study. Unlike other cases of criminal cannibalism, which often involve impulsive acts during moments of extreme psychological stress, Zhumagaliev's consumption of human flesh was carefully planned and ritualized. The dinner parties represent an unprecedented form of psychological sadism in which the satisfaction derived from the crimes was amplified by the successful deception of innocent people. The escape and subsequent disappearance of Zhumagaliev remain subjects of intense speculation and investigation. Some theories suggest that he died shortly after his escape, possibly as a result of illness or accident. Others maintain that he successfully created a new identity and may still be alive, possibly in one of the remote regions of Central Asia or Russia, where it would be easier to avoid detection. The most disturbing possibility is that he has continued killing throughout the decades since his escape. Given his age and the passage of time, this seems increasingly unlikely. But the lack of definitive proof of his death means that the possibility cannot be entirely ruled out. The thought that Medelfang might still be out there, potentially still practicing his horrific crimes, continues to haunt those familiar with his case. The legend of Nikolai Zhumagaliev has taken on a life of its own in popular culture throughout the former Soviet Union. He has become a boogeyman figure, used to frighten children and represent the ultimate embodiment of human evil. Books, films, and television programs have been based on his story, though most sensationalize rather than seriously examine the psychological and social factors that produce such a monster. For law enforcement agencies throughout the region, the Zhumagaliev case remains a cautionary tale about the importance of interagency cooperation and the dangers of allowing ideological considerations to interfere with criminal investigations. The lessons learned from the initial investigation have been incorporated into modern police training programs, helping to ensure that similar cases would be handled more effectively in the future. The victims of Nikolai Zhumagaliev deserve to be remembered not just as statistics in a criminal case, but as individuals whose lives were cut short by one man's unfathomable cruelty. Most were young women with their whole lives ahead of them, people who made the simple mistake of trusting someone who appeared to offer help or friendship. Their deaths serve as a reminder of the vulnerability that exists in human interactions and the importance of remaining vigilant against those who would exploit our basic decency for evil purposes. The unwitting participants in Zhumagaliev's dinner parties represent another category of victim, people who were psychologically traumatized by their unknowing participation in his crimes. Many of these individuals struggled for years with feelings of contamination and violation, unable to escape the knowledge of what they had unknowingly consumed. Their experiences highlight the far-reaching consequences of criminal acts and the ways in which evil can contaminate even those who are completely innocent. Today, more than 4 decades after his first known murder, Nikolai Zhumagaliev remains one of the most notorious criminals in the history of the former Soviet Union. His case continues to be studied by criminologists, psychologists, and law enforcement professionals seeking to understand the extreme depths of human depravity and the factors that can produce such monsters. The mystery of his current whereabouts adds an ongoing element of uncertainty and fear to his legacy. Unlike other notorious criminals whose stories have definite endings, the tale of Metal Fang remains unfinished. The possibility, however remote, that he might still be alive and active somewhere in the world means that his story cannot be relegated entirely to history. The case also serves as a reminder of the importance of effective law enforcement cooperation and the dangers of allowing bureaucratic inefficiency or ideological blindness to interfere with criminal investigations. Had the initial investigation been handled more effectively, it is possible that many lives could have been saved and that Zhumagaliev would never have had the opportunity to escape and disappear. As we reflect on this case in the quiet moments before sleep, we are reminded of the capacity for evil that can exist within seemingly ordinary individuals. Nikolai Zhumagaliev was not a monster from folklore or fiction, but a real person who walked among us, interacted with his neighbors, and successfully maintained a facade of normalcy while committing acts of unthinkable horror. The story of Metal Fang serves as both a warning about the potential for evil in our world and a testament to the importance of vigilance in protecting society from those who would do us harm. His victims, both those who died and those who were psychologically traumatized by unknowing participation in his crimes, deserve to be remembered as real people whose lives were forever changed by their encounter with ultimate evil. In the end, the tale of Nikolai Zhumagaliev is not just about one man's descent into monstrous behavior, but about the broader questions of human nature, social responsibility, and the eternal struggle between good and evil that defines the human experience. His story reminds us that monsters are not born but made, and that society has a responsibility to recognize and address the factors that can transform human beings into predators. The legend of Metal Fang will likely persist for generations to come, serving as a dark reminder of the depths to which human beings can sink when all moral constraints are abandoned. His case stands as one of the most disturbing chapters in the history of criminal behavior, a story that challenges our understanding of human nature and forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the capacity for evil that exists within our species. Whether Nikolai Zhumagaliev is still alive or has long since died, his legacy continues to cast a shadow over the regions where he committed his crimes. The fear and uncertainty surrounding his fate serve as a lasting reminder that some forms of evil are so profound that they leave permanent scars on the collective consciousness of society. As the night grows deeper and we prepare for sleep, we might pause to remember not just the horror of his crimes, but also the importance of remaining vigilant against such evil in our own time. The story of Metal Fang teaches us that monsters can indeed walk among us, hidden behind masks of normalcy and respectability, and that only through continued awareness and cooperation can we hope to protect ourselves and our loved ones from such predators. In remembering this case, we honor the memory of those who died and acknowledge the ongoing trauma of those who survived their encounters with one of history's most disturbing criminals. Their stories serve as a reminder that evil is real, but so too is our capacity to recognize, confront, and ultimately overcome it through justice, understanding, and the shared commitment to protecting the innocent from harm. Case 6, Thomas Quick, Sture Bergwall Saga. In 1991, a man named Sture Ragnar Bergwall voluntarily checked himself into Säter Psychiatric Hospital in central Sweden. He was a quiet, withdrawn figure, admitted for anxiety, drug abuse, and unresolved trauma. A few years later, under a different name, Thomas Quick, he would become Sweden's most infamous serial killer. Over the course of 9 years, he confessed to more than 30 murders, many of them previously unsolved. He was convicted of 8, then years later, he retracted every confession. All convictions were overturned, and Sweden was left to confront the largest legal scandal in its history. The story of Thomas Quick began not with a crime, but with a confession. In 1993, during a therapy session at Säter Hospital, Bergwall claimed responsibility for the murder of 11-year-old Johan Asplund, a boy who had disappeared in 1980 in Sundsvall. The case had gone cold. No body had ever been found. Quick described the abduction in chilling detail, including references to the boy's clothes and the area near his last known location. Police were eager. They had no other leads. Prosecutors reopened the case. As more interviews and therapy sessions followed, Quick confessed to more murders across Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Denmark. He said he had been on killing sprees for decades, targeting children, hikers, travelers, anyone vulnerable. He claimed to dismember bodies, bury them in forests, and sometimes eat their flesh. The media dubbed him the Cannibal of Säter. Investigators formed a task force. Cold cases were pulled from archives. Between 1994 and 2001, Quick was convicted of 8 murders, each based almost entirely on his own confessions. There were no eyewitnesses, no forensic evidence. In some cases, the bodies had never been found. Still, prosecutors claimed he knew details only the killer could know. Quick never showed remorse. During court proceedings, he was eerie, calm, vague when pressed, but firm in his stories. He often smiled. He seemed to enjoy the attention, but cracks began to show. Many of the details Quick remembered had been fed to him during therapy or police interviews. His stories shifted over time. He frequently contradicted himself. In one case, he placed a murder victim in a town she had never visited. In another, he identified a weapon that had never existed. Still, his confessions kept coming. He was heavily medicated on benzodiazepines and antipsychotics and undergoing a controversial form of recovered memory therapy. His therapist believed him. So did the prosecutors. So did the courts. But in 2008, everything unraveled. Journalist Hannes Rustam began investigating the Quick case. He noticed glaring inconsistencies, factual errors, and a total lack of physical evidence. Rustam interviewed Quick in prison. In a stunning admission, Quick admitted he had fabricated everything. He had made it all up. Every confession had been a lie. Why? Because he wanted attention. Because he was mentally unwell. Because the psychiatric system had created a world where he was rewarded for telling horror stories, where being a murderer gave him identity. And because no one stopped him. The fallout was enormous. Between 2010 and 2013, all 8 of Thomas Quick's murder convictions were overturned. The Swedish justice system was humiliated. Police investigators were reprimanded. Prosecutors were investigated. Therapists faced ethical inquiries. It became clear that the justice system had failed spectacularly. Sture Bergwall, no longer calling himself Thomas Quick, was released in 2013 after over 20 years in psychiatric custody. He had never committed any of the murders. His case became the subject of books, documentaries, and a national reckoning. How had a man with no evidence against him been convicted so many times? How had everyone, therapists, police, judges, journalists, believed him? Some blamed the desire to solve cold cases. Others pointed to the blind faith in recovered memory therapy, which was later discredited. A few suggested that a kind of collective delusion had taken hold, a system wanting closure more than truth. Bergwall published his memoir in 2015. He described himself as a man who had lost his identity in a fog of drugs, delusion, and the eager validation of professionals around him. He lived quietly in Dalarna, out of the public eye. Today, the Thomas Quick saga stands as a chilling reminder of what can happen when confession replaces investigation, and when a justice system fails to ask the most important question: where is the evidence? Case 8. Olof Palme assassination suspect, Skandiamannen. On the night of February 28, 1986, Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme was walking home from the Grand Cinema in central Stockholm with his wife Lisbeth. They had declined their security detail, preferring to move quietly through the city. At 11:21 p.m., as they walked along Sveavägen Street, a man approached from behind and fired 2 shots. One struck Palm in the back, killing him instantly. Lisbeth was grazed. The killer ran up a staircase into the night. It was one of the most shocking political assassinations in modern European history. Palm was not just Sweden's leader. He was a symbol, progressive, bold, and outspoken on the global stage. He had made enemies both at home and abroad. In the immediate aftermath, theories flourished. The KGB, the CIA, South African apartheid agents, Kurdish separatists, Swedish right-wing extremists, all were suspected. But no suspect was ever convicted. For decades, the case remained unsolved. Then, in 2020, the Swedish prosecution named a suspect, Stig Engström, an unassuming graphic designer who worked at Skandia Insurance, whose office entrance was just meters from the murder site. He became known in the media as the Skandiamannen, the Skandia Man. Engström had inserted himself into the investigation from the very beginning. He told police he was on the scene seconds after the shots were fired. He claimed he tried to help Lisbeth Palme and described the shooter's clothing, actions, and escape route. But his story changed over time. His timeline didn't match others. Witnesses didn't remember seeing him. His behavior raised suspicions. At the time, police considered him unreliable but not dangerous. He was classified as a confused witness, not a suspect. But over the years, journalists and amateur sleuths began digging. In the 2010 journalist Thomas Pettersson uncovered disturbing details. Engström was a firearms enthusiast. He held right-wing political views. He matched the physical description of the shooter. He had access to the Skandia building, which could have provided an escape route. Pettersson's book argued that Engström had motive, opportunity, and means. He had no solid alibi. His stories were inconsistent. He lied about minor details and appeared to crave attention. Some believed he had staged his presence at the crime scene to cover up his role. The theory gained momentum. In June 2020, Swedish Chief Prosecutor Christer Petersson held a press conference. He named Stig Engström as the likely assassin of Olof Palme. But there was a problem. Engström had died in 2000 by suicide. The case was formally closed. No one would be tried. The reaction was mixed. Some saw closure. They believed Engström had acted alone, a disturbed man who hated Palme and seized a chance to make himself part of history. Others were furious. There was no murder weapon, no forensic evidence, no confession. The suspect had never been interrogated as a primary lead. It felt to many like a convenient ending to an impossible case. Lisbeth Palme, who had survived the attack, had never identified Engström as the shooter. She died in 2018, 2 years before the case closed. The Palme murder became a symbol of Sweden's vulnerability, a reminder that even in a country built on transparency and order, chaos could strike from the shadows. The staircase on Sveavägen still exists, marked by a memorial plaque. Every year on February 28th, flowers appear at the spot where Palme fell. As for Engström, the man now officially blamed for the assassination, his life was marked by frustration, insignificance, and a growing obsession with the case. Whether he pulled the trigger or not, he succeeded in attaching himself to one of the darkest moments in Swedish history and taking the truth to his grave. Case 7, the Fencer, the Vladimir Mukankin story. In the elegant palaces and gilded halls of St. Petersburg, where the ghosts of czars once walked, and the Neva River reflects the grandeur of Imperial Russia, a darkness emerged in the final decade of the 20th century that would forever taint the city's storied legacy. This is the story of Vladimir Mukankin, a man whose athletic prowess and refined demeanor mask the soul of a predator. Known in the chronicles of Russian crime as the Fencer, his tale represents one of the most chilling examples of how talent, discipline, and outward respectability can coexist with the most heinous forms of evil. The story begins in 1951, in the city that was then known as Leningrad, a metropolis still bearing the scars of the devastating siege that had claimed over 1 million lives during World War II. Vladimir Mukhankin was born into this world of reconstruction and renewal, where the Soviet Union was working to rebuild not just its cities, but its national identity. His family belonged to the emerging Soviet middle class, educated, disciplined, and committed to the ideals of socialist progress that defined their era. From his earliest years, Vladimir displayed the physical coordination and mental focus that would later make him a champion athlete. He was tall for his age, with the lean build and quick reflexes that seemed perfectly suited for athletic pursuits. His parents, recognizing their son's potential, enrolled him in various sports programs, hoping to channel his energy and natural abilities into constructive endeavors that would bring honor to both family and state. It was at the age of 12 that Vladimir first picked up a fencing sword, and from that moment, his destiny seemed sealed. The sport of fencing, with its emphasis on precision, strategy, and lightning-fast reactions, appeared to have been created specifically for him. His instructors were amazed by his natural talent and his ability to master complex techniques with minimal instruction. Within months of beginning his training, he was already competing against boys several years older and defeating them with an ease that bordered on the supernatural. Fencing in the Soviet Union was more than just a sport. It was an art form that embodied the ideals of discipline, intellectual prowess, and physical excellence that the state sought to cultivate in its citizens. The sport attracted some of the most intelligent and cultured individuals in Soviet society, people who appreciated both the athletic and aesthetic dimensions of swordplay. Vladimir thrived in this environment, quickly establishing himself as one of the most promising young fencers in the country. As he progressed through the ranks of competitive fencing, Vladimir's personality began to reveal itself more fully. He was intelligent, articulate, and possessed of a natural charisma that made him popular with both teammates and competitors. However, those who knew him well began to notice certain troubling characteristics beneath his polished exterior. He displayed an unusual coldness in his interactions with others, treating people more like objects to be manipulated than as genuine human beings deserving of respect and empathy. His approach to fencing reflected this psychological makeup. While other athletes competed with passion and emotion, Vladimir approached each bout with a calculating precision that was both impressive and somehow unsettling. He seemed to derive satisfaction not just from winning, but from the psychological domination of his opponents. Those who faced him on the strip often reported feeling that they were engaging not just with a superior athlete, but with someone who genuinely enjoyed their suffering and humiliation. By his early 20s, Vladimir had achieved remarkable success in competitive fencing. He represented the Soviet Union in international competitions, bringing home medals and accolades that made him a celebrated figure in Soviet sports. His achievements earned him a place on the national team and access to the privileged world of elite Soviet athletes, with its special shops, foreign travel, and social status that few citizens could ever hope to attain. However, success in athletics was not enough to satisfy the darker impulses that were beginning to emerge in Vladimir's personality. As he matured into adulthood, he began to display increasingly troubling behaviors that suggested a profound disconnect from normal human emotions and moral constraints. He became known for his casual cruelty toward those he perceived as weaker than himself, and for his apparent inability to form genuine emotional connections with other people. The transformation from celebrated athlete to predatory killer was gradual, occurring over several years during the late 1980s and early 1990s. This was a period of tremendous upheaval in Soviet society, as the old certainties of communist rule began to crumble and the nation struggled to define a new identity for itself. In this atmosphere of chaos and uncertainty, individuals like Vladimir found opportunities to explore their darkest impulses without the oversight and control that had previously kept such behaviors in check. His first known murder occurred in 1992, though investigators would later suspect that he may have been killing for several years before this incident came to their attention. The victim was an elderly woman living alone in one of St. Petersburg's older neighborhoods, areas where poverty and social isolation made residents particularly vulnerable to predators. The crime scene revealed a level of violence and cruelty that shocked even experienced investigators who had seen the worst that human beings could do to one another. The murder bore all the hallmarks of what would become Vladimir's distinctive signature. The victim had been subjected to prolonged torture before being killed, with evidence suggesting that the perpetrator had taken considerable time to inflict maximum suffering. The level of planning and preparation evident at the scene indicated that this was not a crime of passion or sudden impulse, but rather a carefully orchestrated act designed to satisfy specific psychological needs within the killer's twisted psyche. What made this crime particularly disturbing was the apparent absence of any traditional motive. The victim had not been robbed, sexually assaulted, or killed as a result of any personal dispute. Instead, the evidence suggested that she had been murdered purely for the psychological satisfaction that the killer derived from the act of causing suffering and death. This absence of conventional motivation would become a consistent pattern in all of Vladimir's subsequent crimes. The investigation into this first murder was hampered by the chaos and dysfunction that characterized Russian law enforcement during the early post-Soviet period. Police departments were understaffed, under-equipped, and struggling to adapt to the new realities of crime in a society that was rapidly abandoning the authoritarian controls of the communist era. Many experienced investigators had left the force, seeking better opportunities in the emerging private sector, leaving behind colleagues who lacked the skills and resources necessary to handle complex criminal cases. Meanwhile, Vladimir continued his athletic career, using his status as a celebrated fencer to maintain his reputation as a respectable member of society. To his teammates, coaches, and the broader sports community, he remained the same disciplined, successful athlete they had always known. His ability to compartmentalize his criminal activities and maintain a facade of normalcy was perhaps his most frightening characteristic, demonstrating a level of psychological sophistication that made him extremely dangerous. The second murder occurred 8 months later, following the same pattern as the first. Another elderly woman, living alone and isolated from her community, was found dead in her apartment after being subjected to prolonged torture. The similarities between the two crimes were unmistakable, but the overwhelmed police investigators initially failed to recognize that they were dealing with a serial killer. Each murder was treated as an isolated incident, preventing authorities from developing the comprehensive understanding of the perpetrator that might have led to his earlier capture. As the body count began to rise throughout 1993 and 1994, Vladimir's methods became increasingly sophisticated, and his psychological satisfaction with the crimes appeared to deepen. He developed elaborate rituals surrounding each murder, treating the entire process as a form of perverted performance art. The weapons he used, the specific forms of torture he employed, and the way he arranged the crime scenes all suggested a mind that had found its true calling in the infliction of suffering upon innocent victims. The choice of elderly women as victims was particularly revealing of Vladimir's psychological makeup. These were individuals who represented vulnerability and helplessness, characteristics that seemed to trigger his predatory instincts. The fact that many of his victims lived alone and had limited contact with the outside world meant that their deaths often went unnoticed for days or even weeks, giving him additional time to savor his crimes and plan future attacks. What distinguished Vladimir from many other serial killers was his ability to maintain his athletic career even as his criminal activities escalated. He continued to compete in fencing tournaments, travel internationally with the Russian national team, and receive recognition for his sporting achievements. This dual existence, respected athlete by day, sadistic killer by night, required a level of psychological compartmentalization that few individuals possess. The investigation began to gain momentum in 1995, when a more experienced detective was assigned to coordinate the various murder cases that had been occurring throughout St. Petersburg. Detective Anatoly Petrov had worked homicide cases throughout the Soviet era and possessed both the investigative skills and institutional knowledge necessary to recognize patterns that younger officers had missed. His first step was to compile a comprehensive database of all unsolved murders involving elderly female victims, looking for similarities that might indicate the work of a single perpetrator. What Petrov discovered was deeply disturbing. Over the course of 3 years, at least 8 elderly women had been murdered in similar circumstances, all showing evidence of prolonged torture, and all killed by someone who appeared to derive psychological satisfaction from the act of inflicting suffering. The geographic distribution of the crime suggested that the perpetrator was highly mobile and familiar with various neighborhoods throughout the city. The breakthrough in the case came through an unexpected source. One of Vladimir's potential victims had survived her encounter with him, though she was so traumatized by the experience that it took months of careful questioning before investigators could obtain a coherent account of what had happened. Her description of her attacker, a tall, athletic man with distinctive mannerisms and speech patterns, provided the first real clue to the killer's identity. The survivor's account was particularly valuable because she had observed her attacker's behavior in detail during the prolonged assault. She described someone who seemed to treat the entire experience as a form of entertainment, taking obvious pleasure in her fear and pain. Most significantly, she noted that he moved with the fluid grace of a trained athlete and demonstrated remarkable physical coordination, even while engaged in acts of extreme violence. This description, combined with other evidence collected from the crime scenes, led investigators to begin focusing on individuals with athletic backgrounds who might have the physical capabilities and psychological profile necessary to commit such crimes. The list of potential suspects was long, but Detective Petrov's methodical approach gradually narrowed the field to a smaller group of individuals who warranted closer scrutiny. Vladimir's name first appeared on the investigators' radar through a combination of circumstantial evidence and intuitive police work. His athletic background, his residence in St. Petersburg, and his travel schedule all placed him in the right locations at the right times to have committed several of the murders. More importantly, those who knew him professionally began to provide information about his personality and behavior that suggested he might be capable of extreme violence. The investigation revealed that Vladimir's reputation within the fencing community was more complex than his public image suggested. While he was universally acknowledged as a skilled athlete, many of his colleagues had noticed disturbing aspects of his personality that made them uncomfortable. Stories emerged of incidents during training sessions where he had displayed unusual aggression and seemed to take excessive pleasure in defeating weaker opponents. One particularly revealing incident had occurred during a practice bout when Vladimir's opponent had been injured by what appeared to be an accidental thrust of his sword. Instead of showing concern for the injured fencer, Vladimir had reportedly smiled and made a comment about how the injury looked interesting. This behavior, while not criminal in itself, fit the psychological profile that investigators were developing of their suspect. The surveillance of Vladimir began in early 1996, with investigators carefully monitoring his movements and activities while continuing to build their case. What they observed only strengthened their suspicions. He displayed a level of situational awareness that suggested he was constantly alert to potential threats, behavior that was consistent with someone engaged in criminal activities. More troubling still were his nocturnal wanderings through the neighborhoods where several of the murders had occurred. The final piece of evidence came through advanced forensic analysis of materials found at the crime scenes. Investigators had discovered traces of a unique metal polish that was used specifically for maintaining fencing equipment. When they obtained a search warrant for Vladimir's apartment, they found not only the same type of polish, but also other evidence that linked him definitively to several of the murders. The arrest of Vladimir Mukhankin on March 15, 1996, sent shockwaves through both the Russian sports community and the general public. Here was a man who had represented his country in international competition, who had been celebrated as an example of Russian athletic excellence, now revealed as one of the most sadistic killers in the nation's history. The cognitive dissonance between his public image and the reality of his crimes was so profound that many people initially refused to believe the charges against him. The interrogation of Vladimir proved to be as disturbing as the crimes themselves. Unlike many criminals who express remorse or attempt to minimize their actions when confronted with evidence of their guilt, he seemed almost proud of what he had accomplished. He described his murders with the same analytical precision that he had once applied to fencing techniques, treating each killing as a problem to be solved and a skill to be perfected. What emerged from these interrogations was a portrait of a man who had never developed normal human empathy or moral constraints. He viewed other people as objects that existed solely for his amusement or utility, and he seemed genuinely puzzled by the moral outrage that his crimes had generated. In his mind, the elderly women he had tortured and killed were no different from the opponents he had defeated in fencing competitions, obstacles to be overcome in pursuit of his own gratification. The trial of Vladimir Mokankin began in October 1996 and became one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in post-Soviet Russian history. The evidence presented by the prosecution was overwhelming, including physical evidence from the crime scenes, witness testimony, and Vladimir's own detailed confessions. The defense attempted to argue that their client was mentally ill and not responsible for his actions. But this strategy proved ineffective given the calculated and methodical nature of his crimes. Throughout the trial, Vladimir's behavior alternated between periods of apparent boredom and moments of intense interest when the details of his crimes were being discussed. He showed no remorse for his actions and seemed to view the proceedings as an opportunity to relive his murders in a public forum. His attitude toward the families of his victims was particularly callous, displaying what appeared to be genuine puzzlement at their emotional distress. The testimony of the surviving victim proved to be one of the most powerful moments of the trial. Despite the obvious trauma she had endured, she provided a clear and detailed account of her encounter with Vladimir, describing not just the physical assault, but also the psychological terror of being in the presence of someone who seemed to lack all human compassion. Her courage in testifying helped ensure that justice would be served for all of his victims. On December 3, 1996, Vladimir Mokankin was found guilty on 8 counts of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The verdict was met with relief from the families of his victims and from the broader Russian public, who had followed the case with horrified fascination. The trial had revealed not just the details of his individual crimes, but also troubling questions about how such a monster could have operated undetected for so long within Russian society. The case had profound implications for the Russian sports community, forcing a painful examination of how athletic achievement and social status could be used to mask criminal behavior. Reforms were implemented in the oversight and psychological evaluation of elite athletes, though critics argued that these measures were insufficient to prevent similar cases in the future. Vladimir's imprisonment marked the end of his killing spree, but it did not bring closure to all those affected by his crimes. The families of his victims struggled to understand how someone could inflict such suffering for no apparent reason, while the broader community grappled with the realization that evil could exist behind even the most respectable facades. The psychological study of Vladimir Mokankin became a subject of intense interest among criminologists and mental health professionals. His case represented a relatively rare example of a serial killer who maintained a successful professional career while simultaneously engaged in extreme criminal behavior. The level of compartmentalization required for such a dual existence suggested psychological mechanisms that were not fully understood by existing theories of criminal behavior. Researchers were particularly intrigued by the relationship between Vladimir's athletic training and his methods of murder. The discipline, focus, and physical control that had made him an exceptional fencer seemed to have been applied to his criminal activities with equally devastating effectiveness. This raised disturbing questions about whether certain forms of training or psychological conditioning might inadvertently create the skills and mindset necessary for extreme criminal behavior. The case also highlighted deficiencies in Russian law enforcement capabilities during the chaotic post-Soviet transition period. The failure to recognize the pattern of serial murders earlier in the investigation, the lack of coordination between different police units, and the inadequate forensic resources available to investigators all contributed to Vladimir's ability to continue killing for several years before being caught. In prison, Vladimir adapted to his new circumstances with the same methodical approach he had applied to everything else in his life. He maintained his physical fitness through exercise routines adapted to the constraints of his cell, and he spent long hours reading books on psychology and criminology, apparently seeking to understand his own behavior from an academic perspective. His interactions with fellow inmates and prison staff revealed the same cold calculation that had characterized his crimes. He showed no interest in forming genuine relationships with other prisoners, treating them instead as subjects for psychological manipulation and control. Prison officials noted that he seemed to derive satisfaction from identifying the weaknesses and vulnerabilities of those around him, though he was careful never to engage in behavior that would result in additional punishment. The impact of Vladimir's crimes extended far beyond his immediate victims to encompass their families, the broader community, and Russian society as a whole. The realization that someone of his stature and accomplishments could be capable of such evil forced a fundamental reevaluation of assumptions about human nature and the reliability of social institutions designed to identify and prevent such behavior. For the families of his victims, the pain was compounded by the knowledge that their loved ones had suffered tremendously before death, and that this suffering had been inflicted purely for the psychological gratification of their killer. The absence of any rational motive for the crimes made them even more difficult to accept and understand, leaving survivors struggling with questions that could never be adequately answered. The elderly community in St. Petersburg was particularly affected by the case, as Vladimir's targeting of vulnerable seniors created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that persisted long after his capture. Many elderly residents became reluctant to live alone or to trust strangers, fundamentally altering their quality of life and sense of security within their own community. The Russian fencing community faced its own reckoning with the legacy of Vladimir's crimes. His achievements in the sport could not be entirely erased, but they were forever tainted by the knowledge of what he had done. Young fencers struggled with the realization that someone they had admired and emulated was capable of such evil, while coaches and administrators implemented new procedures designed to identify and address psychological problems among athletes before they could escalate to criminal behavior. Vladimir's case became a subject of study in criminal justice programs throughout Russia and beyond, serving as an example of how social status and professional achievement could be used to mask criminal behavior. His ability to maintain a successful athletic career while simultaneously engaged in serial murder challenged conventional assumptions about the psychology of killers and the effectiveness of existing detection methods. The investigation techniques developed during the pursuit of Vladimir became standard practices in Russian law enforcement, particularly in cases involving serial crimes. The importance of interagency cooperation, comprehensive crime scene analysis, and psychological profiling was demonstrated by the case, leading to significant improvements in investigative capabilities throughout the Russian criminal justice system. As the years passed in prison, Vladimir showed no signs of remorse or psychological change. He remained as coldly analytical about his crimes as he had been during the original investigation, treating them as interesting case studies rather than expressions of profound evil. His continued lack of empathy or moral understanding served as a reminder that some forms of criminal behavior may be essentially incurable, regardless of the therapeutic interventions attempted. The question of what had created a monster like Vladimir Mukhankin remained unanswered despite years of study and analysis. His childhood had been relatively normal by Soviet standards, his athletic training had been exemplary, and his early adult life had shown no obvious warning signs of the violence to come. This absence of clear causation made his case even more disturbing, suggesting that evil could emerge from circumstances that appeared perfectly ordinary. The surviving victim, who had provided crucial testimony during the investigation, became an advocate for elderly victims of violence, working to improve safety measures and support services for vulnerable populations. Her courage in confronting her attacker in court and her subsequent efforts to prevent similar crimes served as a powerful example of how individuals could transform their own trauma into positive action for others. The legacy of Vladimir Mukhankin extends beyond the immediate horror of his crimes to encompass broader questions about human nature, social responsibility, and the prevention of extreme criminal behavior. His case serves as a reminder that evil can exist in the most unexpected places, and that society must remain vigilant in protecting its most vulnerable members from those who would prey upon them. Prison officials reported that Vladimir continued to maintain his physical fitness well into his later years, treating his exercise routines with the same obsessive attention to detail that had characterized both his athletic career and his criminal activities. This dedication to physical conditioning seemed to serve no purpose other than personal satisfaction, as he had no prospects of release or return to competitive athletics. As Vladimir aged in prison, questions arose about what would happen to him in his final years. Unlike many criminals who eventually expressed some form of remorse or underwent psychological change, he remained as cold and calculating as ever. His case raised difficult questions about how society should deal with individuals who showed no capacity for rehabilitation or moral growth. The impact of his crimes on Russian sports continued to reverberate years after his conviction. New psychological screening procedures were implemented for elite athletes, though critics argued that such measures might not be effective in identifying individuals capable of such sophisticated deception. The case highlighted the limitations of existing methods for detecting dangerous personality disorders in high-functioning individuals. Vladimir's story became a cautionary tale used in criminal justice education, serving as an example of how intelligence, discipline, and social status could be weaponized by individuals with profound personality disorders. His ability to maintain a successful career while simultaneously engaged in serial murder challenged conventional wisdom about the behavior patterns of dangerous criminals. The neighborhoods where Vladimir had committed his crimes slowly began to heal, though the memory of his terror campaign remained embedded in the collective consciousness of local residents. Memorial services for his victims served to honor their memory while acknowledging the profound impact their deaths had on the community. These ceremonies became annual traditions that helped residents process their grief and maintain vigilance against similar threats. Today, more than 2 decades after his conviction, Vladimir Mukhankin remains imprisoned in one of Russia's maximum security facilities. Now in his 70s, he continues to serve his life sentence with the same methodical approach he once applied to athletic training and criminal behavior. His case remains a subject of study for criminologists and psychologists seeking to understand the factors that can transform accomplished individuals into predators of the most dangerous kind. The story of the fencer serves as a dark reminder that monsters can indeed walk among us, hidden behind facades of respectability and achievement. His crimes challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about the potential for evil that exists within seemingly ordinary individuals. As we reflect on this case in the quiet moments before sleep, we are reminded of the importance of protecting the vulnerable members of our society and remaining vigilant against those who would exploit their weaknesses for evil purposes. The victims of Vladimir Mukhankin, elderly women who deserve to live out their final years in peace and security, serve as reminders of the preciousness of life and the devastating consequences when that life is taken by those incapable of human compassion. The tale of the fencer will likely endure as one of the most disturbing chapters in Russian criminal history, a story that forces us to confront the darkest aspects of human nature while honoring the memory of those whose lives were lost to incomprehensible evil. In remembering their stories, we commit ourselves to the ongoing struggle against such darkness and to the protection of those who cannot protect themselves. Case 8. Baader Meinhof Embassy Siege in Stockholm. On the afternoon of April 24, 1975, Stockholm's quiet diplomatic district was shattered by an act of terror. 6 armed members of the German left-wing extremist group Red Army faction, often called the Baader Meinhof Group, stormed the West German embassy at 7 Dag Hammarskjöldsväg, just across from Djurgården Park. Inside the embassy, 12 people were present, including diplomats, secretaries, and military attachés. Within minutes, the attackers had taken them hostage. The terrorists, wearing civilian clothes and armed with automatic weapons, grenades, and explosives, announced their demands: the immediate release of 26 imprisoned RAF members held in West German jails, including founders Andreas Baader, Ulrike Meinhof, and Gudrun Ensslin. The group called themselves the Kommando Höger Mainz, in honor of an RAF member who had died during a hunger strike in prison the year before. Their message was delivered clearly: if the demands weren't met by 2 a.m. the next day, hostages would be executed. The Swedish police quickly sealed off the area. The embassy building, a modest brick structure with glass doors, was surrounded by snipers and negotiators. Helicopters hovered above. The crisis was immediate and intense. Sweden had never seen anything like it. Negotiations began. The RAF group inside the embassy, led by Sieglinde Hoffmann and Norbert Kroker, communicated calmly but firmly. They insisted their threats were real. 2 of the hostages were military attachés, Lieutenant Colonel Andreas von Mirbach and Economic Attaché Heinz Hillegard. Both were high-value targets. As midnight passed with no response from Bonn, the mood inside the embassy darkened. At 2 a.m., the terrorists made good on their threat. They executed von Mirbach with a gunshot to the head. Moments later, Hillegard was shot as well. Then around 2:20 a.m., a powerful explosion rocked the embassy. A bomb, accidentally detonated by one of the attackers while attempting to rig more explosives, destroyed part of the second floor. The blast injured several hostages and killed one of the terrorists, Ulrich Wessel. The chaos gave Swedish police the opportunity to storm the building. In the smoke-filled aftermath, they captured the remaining 5 attackers and rescued the surviving hostages. It was a sudden, violent end to a 12-hour siege that had placed Stockholm at the center of an international crisis. The incident sent shockwaves across Europe. West Germany immediately ruled out any future negotiations with terrorists. Sweden, traditionally neutral and distant from Cold War politics, found itself unwillingly pulled into the violent ideological battles of the time. The surviving RAF members were tried in Swedish courts and sentenced to long prison terms, but many would be quietly extradited to West Germany within a few years. The case sparked debate over Sweden's extradition policies, police preparedness, and diplomatic security. The embassy siege marked the beginning of a shift in how Western Europe viewed terrorism. Until then, groups like the Red Army faction had been seen by some on the political left as misguided idealists. After Stockholm, the narrative changed. The violence was no longer abstract. It was on neutral ground, against unarmed civilians, in the heart of a peaceful capital. The building itself was severely damaged and later remodeled. Today, the site bears no public plaque or memorial, but the events of April 24, 1975, are deeply remembered by those who lived through them. Survivors recall the cold professionalism of the attackers, the sudden explosion, and the eerie silence that followed the assault. The Baader-Meinhof embassy siege remains one of the most dramatic and deadly terrorist incidents in Swedish history, a moment when global extremism reached past borders and turned an embassy into a battlefield. Case 9, Clark Olofsson's crime empire. To some, he was Sweden's most charismatic criminal. To others, he was a manipulative career offender with a flair for drama. But one thing was undeniable. Clark Olofsson was a central figure in Swedish crime from the 1960s through the 1980s. His life was a whirlwind of bank robberies, daring prison escapes, high-profile romances, and the kind of media attention usually reserved for rock stars. Born in 1947 in Trollhättan, Olofsson's early life was marked by instability. His father left when he was young, and his mother struggled with mental illness. By his teens, he was stealing bikes, breaking into shops, and landing in juvenile detention centers. He was smart, persuasive, and had a talent for drawing people in. His criminal career officially began in the mid-1960s. At 18, he was arrested for burglary and assaulting a police officer. A year later, he escaped from prison and committed several armed robberies. He was caught, imprisoned again, and escaped again. This pattern, escape, crime, capture, would repeat throughout his life. Olofsson had a unique quality that made him different from other criminals. He was charming, handsome, well-spoken, and fearless. He gave interviews from prison, wrote letters to the press, and attracted admirers. Reporters covered his court appearances like red carpet events. Some even compared him to a Scandinavian version of Bonnie and Clyde, except he played both roles. In 1973, Olofsson's name became permanently linked to a term that would travel the world: Stockholm Syndrome. During the infamous Norrmalmstorg robbery, Jan Erik Olsson, a former associate of Olofsson's, took hostages in a bank and demanded that Clark be brought to the scene. The government agreed. Olofsson walked into the vault and spent 6 days inside with the hostages. During that time, the hostages began to sympathize with their captors. They later defended Olofsson and claimed they trusted him more than the police. Though Olofsson claimed he was only trying to defuse the situation, many believe he manipulated everyone in the room, criminals, hostages, and authorities alike. He was acquitted in that case, but his legend only grew. In the years that followed, Olofsson continued committing crimes across Europe. He pulled off robberies in Denmark, smuggled drugs in the Netherlands, and was arrested multiple times. He escaped from prison at least 3 times, each time with cinematic flair. Once by climbing out a bathroom window, once through a tunnel, and once by taking a guard hostage. Despite everything, he maintained an odd celebrity status. He was interviewed by major newspapers, wrote an autobiography, and was even the subject of a Netflix drama decades later. Women wrote him love letters from across the continent. He fathered children with multiple partners, some of whom remained loyal to him even after he vanished back into prison. By the 1980s, he was no longer just a Swedish criminal. He was a European one. Authorities in Belgium, Germany, and France all had open files on him. He was fluent in several languages and used dozens of aliases. At one point, Interpol named him one of the most wanted men in Western Europe. In 1999, while serving time in Denmark, he completed a university degree in journalism. He claimed he was rehabilitated, but soon after his release, he was arrested again, this time for a massive drug trafficking operation involving 100 kilos of amphetamines. He was sentenced to 14 years in prison. Even in his later years, Olofsson continued to reinvent himself. He launched websites, wrote articles, and gave interviews from behind bars. He remained a source of fascination to criminologists and journalists alike, both for his criminal record and his ability to captivate people. Clark Olofsson was released from prison in 2018 and lived briefly in Sweden before moving to Belgium. He gave interviews reflecting on his life, often blaming the system for pushing him into crime, while never quite denying the thrill he found in it. In June 2025, he died at the age of 78 after a long illness. His death marked the end of an era, a man who had, for decades, played cat and mouse with police, prosecutors, and public opinion. To some, he was a tragic figure, a product of broken institutions. To others, he was simply a manipulator who enjoyed the chase. Either way, Clark Olofsson remains etched in Swedish history, not just as a criminal, but as a phenomenon. A man who blurred the lines between outlaw, celebrity, and legend. Thank you for joining me in the darkness tonight on Midnight and Murder. Until we meet again when the clock strikes 12, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, the truth is often stranger and more chilling than fiction. Sweet dreams.